the beginning, there was one language, one tongue, one way of speaking that united all of humankind under a single voice. This wasn't merely a convenience of communication. It was something far more profound. It was the last thread connecting humanity to its origins, to the time before the Great Flood, to the world that once was and would never be again. The story we're about to explore has echoed through millennia, embedded itself into countless cultures, and become synonymous with human ambition itself. The Tower of Babel. Even those who have never opened a Bible know this name. It represents humanity's greatest architectural achievement and its most spectacular failure. But what really happened in the ancient land of Shinar? What drove our ancestors to construct a tower reaching toward the heavens? And why did this singular act of human cooperation result in the permanent fracturing of human civilization? The answers lie buried beneath layers of sand and time. In the archaeological remains of ancient Mesopotamia, in texts written on clay tablets thousands of years before Christ, and in the collective memory of peoples scattered across every continent. This is not simply a story about a tower. It's the story of who we are, where we came from, and the moment when humanity's unified vision shattered into 10,000 fragments. To understand Babel, we must first understand the world that gave birth to it. The earth was still young in human terms. The great deluge had receded. Waters that had covered the highest mountains returned to their bounds. The ark had come to rest on Ararat. Noah and his family had emerged into a world washed clean empty, waiting to be repopulated. This was the reset, the divine do-over. Humanity was being given a second chance. According to the genealogies preserved in Genesis, the timeline between Noah's emergence and the events at Babel spans several generations, perhaps a century, perhaps longer. The exact chronology has been debated by scholars for millennia. But what matters more than the precise number of years is understanding what this period represented. This was the age of unity, the age before division, the last time all human beings shared not just a common ancestor in the recent past, but a common language, a common purpose, and a common location. The survivors of the flood multiplied. From Noah's 3 sons came the 70 nations that would eventually populate the earth. But initially, they remained together. They traveled as one people, speaking as one people, dreaming as one people. The biblical text tells us they journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar, and there they settled. Shinar. The ancient name still carries weight, even though few today could point to it on a map. This was the land that would later be known as Babylonia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization itself, modern Iraq. But in that ancient time it was called Shinar, and it was here that humanity made its stand. Why did they stop here? Why not continue spreading across the earth as they had been commanded? The biblical narrative provides a hint. The plain of Shinar was perfect, fertile, flat, ideal for agriculture, for building, for the construction of cities. Unlike the mountainous regions they had traveled through, unlike the broken landscape that characterized much of the post-flood world, Shinar offered something precious: space, possibility, the blank canvas upon which to paint humanity's future. But there was something else drawing them to remain together, something deeper than mere convenience or agricultural abundance. There was fear. The generation that came after Noah still carried the trauma of the flood in their collective memory. They had heard the stories from their grandparents and great-grandparents. They knew about the world before, about the violence and corruption that had provoked divine judgment, about the waters that rose and covered everything, about the months spent in darkness inside a wooden vessel while civilization drowned outside. This wasn't ancient history to them. This was family history. This was the event that defined their entire existence. And with that memory came a question that haunted them. Could it happen again? God had promised Noah that never again would a flood destroy all life on earth. The rainbow stood as a sign of that covenant. But how much did the people trust that promise? How secure did they feel in a world that had so recently demonstrated its capacity for total annihilation? Fear once planted grows deep roots, and from those roots can spring the most extraordinary actions. The people in the plain of Shinar looked at their unity and saw their strength. They looked at their shared language and saw their power. They recognized that together they could accomplish anything. And in that recognition, an idea began to form. an idea that would consume their imagination and redirect the entire course of human history. But before we arrive at that moment of decision, we need to understand more deeply the world they inhabited. The Mesopotamian plain wasn't just any location. It was, by all measures, the birthplace of human civilization as we know it. Archaeological evidence confirms what the biblical narrative suggests. This region saw humanity's first cities, first writing systems, first legal codes, first organized religions, and first monumental architecture. The land between the rivers had been inhabited even before the flood, according to both biblical and Mesopotamian sources. After the waters receded, it was here that human culture bloomed again with astonishing speed. Within generations, people were not just farming, but creating complex irrigation systems. They weren't just building shelters, but designing urban centers. They weren't just communicating, but developing writing. Something about this place catalyzed human achievement. Perhaps it was the fertility of the alluvial soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates. Perhaps it was the flat terrain that made agriculture and construction easier. Perhaps it was the central location that made it a natural gathering point for travelers from all directions. Or perhaps there was something else, something in the collective human psyche that recognized this place as significant, as sacred, as the spot where humanity would make its mark. The people who settled in Shinar were not primitive. This is crucial to understand. Our modern imagination often reduces ancient peoples to crude caricatures, barely advanced beyond cave dwellers. But the biblical account and the archaeological record tell a different story. These were sophisticated people. They had inherited knowledge from the pre-flood world. They had skills in agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, and construction. They were organized, purposeful, and ambitious. They also possessed something that earlier generations lacked. They had observed the flood and survived it. They had seen what happened when humanity spread out and became vulnerable. They had learned, or thought they had learned, a crucial lesson. Unity meant survival. Separation meant risk. Together they were strong. Divided they might face divine judgment again. This perspective, however logical it seemed, put them in direct conflict with the divine mandate they had received. God had commanded Noah and his descendants to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, not gather in one place, not concentrate in a single region, but spread out, disperse. Take dominion over all the corners of the world. The people in Shinar heard that command and decided against it. This wasn't passive disobedience. This wasn't neglect or forgetfulness. This was active rejection of the divine plan. They made a conscious choice to stay together, to remain unified, to build in one location rather than spread across the earth, and to ensure that they would never be separated. They conceived of a project so massive, so permanent, so impressive that it would bind them together forever. They would build a city, and in that city they would construct a tower that would reach unto heaven itself. The decision to build wasn't made in a single moment. It emerged from countless conversations, from meetings of elders and leaders, from the gradual consensus of a people who shared a common fear and a common dream. They discussed the best location within the plain. They debated the design. They calculated what resources would be needed. They organized themselves into work groups and specializations. This was perhaps humanity's first large-scale collaborative project, requiring coordination on a level never before attempted. And they possessed one enormous advantage. They all spoke the same language. We cannot overestimate the significance of linguistic unity. Communication wasn't just easier, it was perfect. Every instruction was understood exactly as intended. Every plan could be explained with precision. Every technical term carried the same meaning for everyone. There were no translators needed, no risk of miscommunication, no cultural barriers to overcome. When someone said stone, everyone knew exactly what was meant. When someone described a measurement or technique, everyone comprehended it immediately. This linguistic unity created efficiency beyond anything we can imagine in our fractured modern world. Projects that would normally take years of expertise and coordination could be organized in weeks. Technical knowledge could be transferred instantly. Innovations could be shared across the entire population without loss of meaning. The people in Shinar had stumbled upon the ultimate competitive advantage, and they knew it. The text preserves their own words, spoken in that ancient tongue. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. This simple statement reveals so much. They weren't just gathering existing stones. They were manufacturing building materials. They had discovered or invented fired brick technology, a revolutionary advancement that would define Mesopotamian architecture for millennia to come. Natural stone was scarce in the alluvial plain of Shinar. The region lacked the rocky outcroppings that characterized other parts of the Near East, so the people innovated. They formed clay from the riverbeds into uniform shapes. They dried these shapes in the sun, or, more significantly, they fired them in kilns at high temperatures, creating bricks that were harder and more durable than sun-dried mud brick. This wasn't primitive technology. This was sophisticated materials engineering, and they didn't stop there. They had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. The word translated as slime refers to bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum-based substance that seeped from the ground in certain areas of Mesopotamia. Ancient peoples learned to collect this black, sticky material and use it as waterproofing and binding agent. It was superior to traditional lime mortar in many ways, creating water-resistant seals and incredibly strong bonds between bricks. The combination of fired bricks and bitumen mortar represented cutting-edge construction technology. With these materials, the people of Shinar could build higher and stronger than anyone before them. They could create structures that would endure for centuries. They could, they believed, build something permanent, something that would outlast any future catastrophe, something that would stand as a testimony to human achievement for all time. But materials alone don't create monumental architecture. You need vision, you need planning, you need leadership, and most of all, you need purpose. What was driving these people wasn't just the desire for shelter or even for an impressive building. They were driven by something deeper, something that touches the core of human nature itself. They wanted to make a name for themselves. This phrase, preserved in the ancient text, reveals the true motivation behind Babel. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Here, in their own words, is the entire project laid bare. This was about identity, about legacy, about ensuring that their unified civilization would be remembered forever. Making a name for oneself might sound like simple pride or vanity to modern ears, but in the ancient world, a name carried much deeper significance. A name meant identity, legacy, continuation, memory. To have your name remembered meant that you had lived meaningfully. To have no name meant you were forgotten, erased from history, as if you had never existed at all. The people of Shinar weren't just building a tower. They were attempting to secure immortality through human achievement. There's something profoundly human about this desire. Every civilization that has ever existed has sought to create lasting monuments. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of Greece and Rome, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the skyscrapers of modern cities. We build not just for utility, but for meaning. We construct not just to house our bodies, but to express our spirits. We reach upward not just because we need height, but because we need significance. The people at Babel were us. They felt what we feel. They dreamed what we dream. They faced the existential terror of meaninglessness and fought against it with the only weapons available to them: cooperation, technology, and ambition. In this sense, the tower they conceived was the most human project imaginable. It was our ancestors refusing to be forgotten. But there was another dimension to their motivation. That final phrase, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. This reveals their deepest fear. They were terrified of separation. Dispersal meant vulnerability. It meant losing their linguistic unity. It meant potentially facing whatever dangers lurked in unknown regions without the protection of their numbers. It meant perhaps being judged again individually rather than as a unified group. So they built not just to be remembered, but to stay together. The tower was to be their anchor. As long as it stood, they would have a reason to remain in Shinar. As long as it grew taller, they would have a shared project requiring their continued cooperation. As long as they could point to it and say, "We built that together," they would have an identity that transcended individual families or tribes. The tower would make them permanent. There's bitter irony in this. as we'll see. But in that moment, in the plain of Shinar, as the first bricks were being formed and fired, as the first foundations were being laid, as the first courses of the structure began to rise from the flat earth, the people felt hope. They felt purpose. They felt the electric excitement that comes from being part of something greater than yourself. Work on the tower began. The flickering torchlight danced across the clay tablets as the scribes worked through the night, their reed styluses carving humanity's dreams into wet clay. In the great assembly hall of Shinar, where the elders gathered beneath cedar beams that had traveled down the Euphrates from distant mountains, a new order was taking shape. The question was no longer whether they would build, but how high they would dare to reach. Among the voices that echoed through those vaulted chambers, one rose above the rest with particular intensity. His name was Nimrod, though the meaning of that name would be debated by scholars for millennia to come. Some would say it meant rebel, others would claim it spoke of leopard-like strength. Still others would insist it derived from words meaning to rule or to have dominion. What remained undisputed was the power this man wielded over the imagination of his generation. Nimrod emerged from a lineage that traced itself back to Cush, son of Ham, grandson of Noah himself. In the genealogies carefully preserved by the ancient scribes, his name appears with a curious distinction, marked not merely as one who lived, but as one who began to be mighty in the earth. This phrase, so carefully chosen, carried implications that would resonate through history. He was not born mighty, the text suggested, but became so through his own ambition and will. He was humanity's first self-made king, the prototype of the strong man who would shape civilization through force of personality and vision. The stories told around the fires spoke of his prowess as a hunter, a mighty hunter before the Lord, they said, though that phrase, too, carried layers of meaning that would trouble interpreters for generations. Did before the Lord mean in the sight of God, under divine observation, or did it carry the more troubling implication of in defiance of, in opposition to? The Hebrew word used could bend either way, and perhaps that ambiguity was itself the point. Nimrod operated in that gray space where human excellence and human hubris become impossible to separate. His hunting prowess was not merely about bringing down wild beasts, though the legends certainly painted him as a slayer of lions and subduer of aurochs. In that ancient world, the hunter was a figure of cosmic significance. He was the one who ventured beyond the safety of settled lands, who confronted chaos in its raw animal form and returned victorious. The imagery of the hunt permeated kingship throughout the ancient Near East. To be a hunter was to be a protector, a provider, a warrior, a ruler. Nimrod's reputation as a hunter established him as the natural leader of men, the one capable of organizing collective action against common threats. But Nimrod's ambitions extended far beyond the hunt. The biblical text lists the cities that formed the foundation of his kingdom, a realm that stretched across the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar, and then extending north into Ashur, where the mighty cities of Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin would rise. These were not mere villages, but the great population centers that would define civilization for the next 2,000 years. Archaeological excavations would later confirm the antiquity and grandeur of these sites, their massive walls and temple platforms, testifying to the organizational capacity and ambition of their builders. What made Nimrod's kingdom revolutionary was not merely its extent, but its nature. Before him, the post-flood world had begun to organize itself along family lines, tribal clusters, that maintained their own customs and territories. Nimrod created something different, a multi-city network bound together, not by kinship but by political power, economic interdependence, and shared vision. He was inventing empire, that most characteristic form of human organization that would come to dominate world history. And at the heart of this empire, both geographically and symbolically, stood Babel. The name itself was carefully chosen. In the language of Shinar, Babel meant gate of God, the threshold between earth and heaven, between human and divine realms. It spoke of a city with cosmic significance, a place where the boundaries that separated heaven and earth might become permeable. Every brick laid, every layer raised higher, was an assertion that humanity could create such a portal through its own efforts. As construction began in earnest, the plains of Shinar transformed into the greatest building site the world had ever seen. The scale of the operation required an unprecedented level of organization. Labor had to be divided, specialized, coordinated. Some workers dug clay from the riverbanks. Others shaped it into bricks. Still others operated the kilns where the bricks were fired to stone-like hardness. Teams of haulers transported materials, builders laid courses, engineers calculated angles and weights. Architects revised plans based on the realities of construction. The technology they employed was itself revolutionary. "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly," the builders had declared. This was not casual construction with sun-dried mud bricks that would dissolve in the first hard rain. These were kiln-fired bricks, each one subjected to temperatures that transformed clay into something approaching stone. And rather than simple mud mortar, they used bitumen, the thick petroleum tar that seeped up from underground deposits in that region. This waterproof, adhesive material created bonds of remarkable strength. They were building not for a generation, but for eternity. The tower itself began to take shape according to a design that would become archetypal for sacred architecture throughout Mesopotamia. It was a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid that rose in successive rectangular stages, each level smaller than the one below, creating a mountain-like silhouette against the flat plain. At the summit would stand the temple chamber, the house where heaven and earth met, where the gods might descend and humans might ascend. But unlike the ziggurats that would follow, each dedicated to a particular deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon, this tower served a different purpose. It was dedicated to the collective power of humanity itself, to the achievement of working together with one language and one purpose. The god it honored was human potential, human unity, human determination to transcend the limitations that nature and heaven had imposed. Nimrod understood that buildings are never merely functional structures. They are statements in stone, brick, and mortar. They declare who we are, what we value, what we believe possible. The tower rising at Babel declared that humanity acknowledged no ceiling to its aspirations, no limits to its reach. Each new level completed was a victory over gravity, over entropy, over the voices that whispered that such a thing could not be done. Yet even as the tower rose, even as the city around it expanded and filled with peoples from across the plain, tensions began to emerge within the great project. Not everyone shared Nimrod's vision with equal enthusiasm. Among the workers and overseers, among the family clans that had contributed their labor and resources, questions began to surface that could not be easily answered. There were those who remembered the stories their grandparents told, the tales of the world before the flood, when violence had filled the earth and corruption had spread until divine judgment became inevitable. They looked at Nimrod's growing power, at the way he consolidated authority in his own hands, at how the project had become inseparable from his personal glory, and they wondered if they were repeating the mistakes of that drowned generation. The tower was meant to make a name for humanity, but increasingly it seemed designed to make a name for one man. Others questioned the spiritual implications of what they were doing. Among the descendants of Shem, particularly those who maintained their separation from Nimrod's kingdom, there were voices warning that the tower represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between Creator and creation. The covenant God had established with Noah after the flood had promised that divine judgment would never again come through water, that the rhythms of nature would continue uninterrupted as long as earth endured. But that covenant also implied human responsibilities, a recognition of divine sovereignty, a posture of humility before the Creator, who had both destroyed and preserved. The tower seemed to embody the opposite spirit. It was built on the assumption that humanity could secure its own future through technological achievement, that it could force open the gates of heaven through sheer determination and coordinated effort. It replaced trust in divine providence with confidence in human capability. And while that confidence had produced remarkable results, it also contained the seeds of a dangerous pride. Among Nimrod's own advisors, there emerged a figure who would play a crucial role in the intensifying drama. Though the ancient texts preserve his name only obliquely, he was the chief architect, the master builder, whose mathematical genius and engineering vision had made the tower possible. While Nimrod provided the political will and organizational power, it was this architect who translated ambition into reality, who calculated the ratios and proportions that would allow sun-dried brick and bitumen to bear the enormous weight of a structure ascending toward the clouds. He had devoted years to studying the properties of materials, to understanding how weight distributed through structures, to developing techniques for keeping courses level as they rose higher and higher. His clay tablets filled with calculations, his mind constantly working through problems of stress and support. He had become consumed by the challenge of the tower in a way that went beyond duty or loyalty to Nimrod. For him, the tower had become the ultimate test of human knowledge and skill, a puzzle of cosmic significance that demanded solution. But as the structure climbed higher, as it passed heights no building had ever achieved, the architect began to encounter problems that his calculations had not predicted. The tower was so massive that its own weight caused the lower levels to compress and settle, creating instabilities that propagated upward. The wind forces at upper levels were far greater than anyone had experienced in lower buildings, requiring constant adjustments to the design. And the simple logistics of hauling materials to ever-increasing heights slowed construction to a crawl. More troubling than these technical challenges was something the architect had begun to sense, but could not quite articulate. The higher the tower rose, the more it seemed to resist further construction. Not in any physical sense that he could measure or calculate, but in some more fundamental way. Workers reported strange dreams when they slept in the tower's shadow. Some spoke of feeling watched from above, of sensing that their work was observed by eyes that did not approve. A few claimed to hear voices in languages they did not recognize, warnings, or perhaps curses, carried on winds that seemed to blow from no earthly direction. The architect dismissed these reports as superstition, the inevitable byproduct of exhausted men working at unprecedented heights, yet he could not entirely shake his own unease. Late at night, alone at the top of the rising structure, with only the stars above and the plains spreading dark below, he sometimes felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were not simply building tall. They were asserting human autonomy, declaring independence from divine oversight, creating a monument to the belief that humanity needed no guidance or assistance beyond its own ingenuity. Among the workers themselves, fault lines began to appear that reflected deeper divisions within the growing city. The project had drawn peoples from across the plain, from different family lines descended from Noah's sons. While they all spoke the same language, shared the same grammar and vocabulary that had been passed down from the pre-flood world, subtle differences in dialect and accent marked their various origins. These differences, barely noticeable at first, began to take on greater significance as the stress of the massive construction project created friction between groups. The descendants of Ham, Nimrod's own people, held the positions of authority on the project. They were the overseers, the quota setters, the enforcers who maintained discipline and productivity. The Japhethites who had come to Shinar, seeking opportunity, found themselves assigned to the most physically demanding tasks, the hauling and lifting that broke bodies and spirits. And the Semites, the descendants of Shem, who had joined the project, despite their elders' warnings, occupied an ambiguous middle position, possessing valuable skills but never quite trusted by Nimrod's inner circle. What had begun as a unified project driven by shared purpose was gradually fragmenting into a labor system that looked disturbingly like coercion. Workers no longer volunteered their effort out of enthusiasm for the grand vision. They worked because Nimrod's enforcers demanded it, because failure to meet quotas brought punishment, because the city's economy had reorganized itself entirely around the tower's construction and there were no alternatives for survival. The transformation was subtle enough that no single moment marked the shift from voluntary cooperation to compulsory service. It happened through 1,000 small changes, each one justified by the demands of the project. Quotas were imposed to ensure adequate material supply. Work schedules were extended to take advantage of favorable weather. Discipline was tightened to prevent accidents. Rest days were eliminated to maintain momentum. Before the workers fully understood what had happened, they found themselves trapped in a system that valued the tower's completion above their own welfare. In the elite quarters where Nimrod and his administrators lived, where the benefits of the burgeoning civilization were most evident, there was little awareness of or concern for the growing dissatisfaction among the laborers. The city's wealth was increasing, its power and influence spreading. Traders came from distant lands to see the great tower and exchange goods. Nimrod's kingdom was becoming the center of the known world, exactly as he had envisioned. The voices of exhausted workers were easy to ignore amid the celebration of achievement. Yet there were a few among the elite who began to question whether the tower's cost might be too high. One such figure was a younger member of Nimrod's court, a skilled administrator who had risen through his ability to organize complex logistics. He had been among the project's earliest enthusiasts, convinced that the tower would unite humanity and showcase its capabilities. But as he spent more time among the workers, tallying their output and managing their deployment, he began to see the human price being paid for each cubit. The tower rose. He saw men aged before their time, their bodies broken by endless labor. He saw families torn apart as workers were moved to wherever they were most needed, without regard for their personal connections. He saw a generation of children growing up without fathers present, raised in a city that had become a vast construction camp where everything served the tower's demands. And he began to question whether a structure built on such suffering could truly represent humanity's greatness. His doubts led him to seek out some of the Semite elders who had refused to join Nimrod's project, who maintained separate communities on the periphery of the plain. These were men who had known Noah himself, who had heard directly from the patriarch's lips the stories of the antediluvian world and the judgment that had come. They welcomed the troubled young administrator and shared with him perspectives that were being suppressed within Nimrod's increasingly monolithic kingdom. They spoke of the danger of unity without righteousness, of how the pre-flood generation had also been unified in its rebellion against divine order. They explained that God had never intended humanity to be a single, undifferentiated mass, but a diversity of peoples, each with its own identity, territory, and relationship with the Creator. The scattering God had commanded to fill the earth and multiply across its face was not a burden to be resisted, but a blessing to be embraced. It protected against the kind of concentrated tyranny that was now emerging in Shinar. They warned that Nimrod's project was not merely about building height, but about centralizing power, about creating a system where a single man and his vision could dominate all human activity. The tower was both symbol and tool of this centralization. It focused all energy and resources toward one goal, subordinating every other human concern. And once completed, it would stand as an eternal monument to Nimrod's rule, a structure so massive and impressive that future generations would be psychologically bound to the system that created it. The young administrator found these arguments troubling but compelling. He began to see the Tower Project with new eyes, not as humanity's greatest achievement, but as its greatest folly, a massive misdirection of human potential toward a goal that served only the ego of one ruler and the false promise of security through technological prowess. Yet he was trapped by his position within the system. To speak openly against the project would mean exile or worse. Nimrod had grown increasingly intolerant of dissent as the tower consumed more resources and generated more problems. As the tower continued to rise, as it became visible from ever more distant parts of the plain, it began to affect the psychology of everyone who lived within sight of it. It was impossible to ignore, dominating the landscape like a man-made mountain. Those who supported the project saw it as a source of pride and accomplishment, physical proof of human progress. Those who doubted saw it as an ominous presence, a testament to human overreach that seemed to grow more menacing with each passing season. The ancient texts preserve hints that there were active resistance movements working against the tower's completion, though the details remain fragmentary and disputed. Some workers began sabotaging materials, mixing ash into clay, or watering down bitumen so that bricks would fail after being incorporated into the structure. Others engaged in what might be called work slowdowns, meeting minimum quotas but refusing to show the enthusiasm and initiative that had characterized the project's early phases. A few even attempted direct attacks on the structure itself, though Nimrod's guards prevented any serious damage. These acts of resistance only hardened Nimrod's determination. He increased security around the construction site, stationed guards at every level of the tower, instituted punishments for insufficient productivity. The project that had begun with excitement and voluntary cooperation was now maintained through surveillance and threat. The transformation was complete. What had been offered as humanity's greatest collective achievement had become humanity's greatest collective prison. Yet Nimrod himself seemed blind to this transformation, or perhaps indifferent to it. From his palace, decorated with the finest materials brought from across the known world, he could see only success. The tower rose higher each month. His kingdom's wealth and power increased. His name was spoken with awe and fear across the plain. He had achieved what no previous ruler had imagined possible: the unification of humanity under a single authority, pursuing a single goal. If that achievement required harsh measures to maintain, so be it. Great works demanded great discipline. He had even begun to style himself in ways that suggested divine pretensions. Court protocols developed that required subjects to prostrate themselves before him. Prayers and offerings were made to his health and success. His pronouncements were recorded on clay tablets with the same reverence accorded to divine oracles in other traditions. Nimrod was not content to be merely the greatest of kings. He was positioning himself as the mediator between heaven and earth, the one through whom all blessings flowed, the substitute for the God his subjects' ancestors had worshipped. The architect who had made the tower possible found himself increasingly isolated as he recognized the true nature of what he had created. His mathematical genius had been put in service of tyranny. His engineering brilliance had built a prison of unprecedented scale. The tower that was supposed to reach heaven had instead become a monument to human pride and cruelty. Yet he could not stop. He had invested too much of himself in the project. His identity was bound up with the tower's success. To abandon it now would be to admit that his life's work had been a catastrophic error. So he continued calculating, continued solving the endless engineering challenges, continued pushing the structure higher, even as his soul grew darker. He had become a cautionary tale in the making, a man whose technical competence far exceeded his wisdom, whose ability to do something had blinded him to the question of whether he should. The tower would stand, if it stood at all, as testimony to both his genius and his failure. In the city below, life had become entirely oriented around the tower's demands. Markets existed to feed workers. Crafts focused on producing tools and materials for construction. Education trained the next generation for their roles in the ongoing project. Entertainment provided just enough distraction to prevent complete despair. Everything served the tower, and the tower served Nimrod's vision of unified humanity under his absolute control. Yet the very success of this system contained the seeds of its undoing. The more tightly Nimrod controlled his kingdom, the more he insisted on absolute unity of purpose and effort, the more he created the conditions for spectacular failure. He had built a house of cards of unprecedented size, where every element depended on every other element continuing to function exactly as designed. Any significant disruption to the system would cascade into catastrophe. The bricks themselves became objects of worship, not in the spiritual sense, but in the pride of their makers. Each one represented triumph over the natural order, victory over the limitations imposed by geography and circumstance. The workers would hold up particularly well-formed bricks, showing them to supervisors with expressions of pride, as if presenting precious gems rather than simple building materials. The kilns burned day and night, their fires fed by an endless supply of fuel, gathered from territories that stretched dozens of miles in every direction. Teams of workers specialized in nothing but fuel collection, stripping entire groves of trees, uprooting bushes, harvesting dried reeds from marshlands. The bitumen pits became scenes of dangerous labor. Men descended into the dark, sticky depths with ropes tied around their waists, their bodies soon coated in the black substance that would become the tower's mortar. The bitumen had to be heated to the right consistency, a process that required skill and experience. Too hot, and it became dangerously fluid, capable of causing severe burns. Too cool, and it wouldn't bond the bricks properly. The workers who mastered this became elite craftsmen, their knowledge passed down through carefully guarded apprenticeships. As the tower rose higher, a new problem emerged that no one had anticipated. The simple act of moving materials from ground level to the construction site became an engineering challenge of unprecedented complexity. Ramps had to be built, then rebuilt at steeper angles. The incline had to be gradual enough for laden workers to ascend, yet direct enough not to waste valuable space. These ramps themselves became architectural marvels, spiraling around the tower's exterior like the path of a mountain trail. Teams were organized with military precision. Some groups did nothing but transport bricks from the kilns to the base of the ramps. Others specialized in moving these bricks up the ramps to staging areas at various levels. Still, others took them from staging areas to the actual construction site. Water carriers formed their own continuous chain, ensuring that workers at every level stayed hydrated in the relentless heat. The organization required to keep thousands of workers coordinated, supplied, and productive would have impressed generals of future empires. The tower began to dominate not just the physical landscape, but the mental landscape of everyone within hundreds of miles. People spoke of it constantly. Children played games mimicking the builders. Songs were composed celebrating its construction. The tower became the central reference point for all directions, all measurements, all aspirations. Time itself was marked by its progress, rather than by seasons or harvests. People would say something happened when the tower was 50 cubits high, or 100, or 150. Nimrod understood that the tower's symbolic power had to be carefully cultivated. He established festivals marking significant construction milestones. When the tower reached 100 cubits, work stopped for 3 days of celebration. Sacrifices were offered not to any deity, but to human achievement itself. The finest foods were distributed among the workers. Musicians performed. Speeches were delivered extolling the magnificence of human potential unleashed from divine constraint. These celebrations served multiple purposes. They maintained morale among workers whose labor was back-breaking and dangerous. They reinforced the ideological foundation of the project, reminding everyone why they were building. And they attracted even more people to Shinar, as stories of these grand festivals spread to distant lands. Each celebration became a recruitment event, drawing fresh workers to replace those who had died or been injured, and adding to the ranks to accelerate progress. But as the tower climbed higher, something began to shift in the atmosphere of the plain. The workers at the highest levels reported strange experiences. The wind at such altitudes blew constantly, with a force unknown at ground level. Men had to secure themselves with ropes to avoid being blown off the structure. The air felt thinner, making breath come harder after exertion. Some reported feeling dizzy, experiencing visions, hearing voices in the wind. These reports troubled the supervisors, but Nimrod seized upon them as evidence that the tower was working. They were approaching the realm of the divine, he declared. Of course, the atmosphere would be different. Of course, they would experience unusual phenomena. This was proof they were succeeding in their quest to reach the heavens. The dizzy spells and visions were simply the human body and mind adapting to the presence of the divine realm. The workers at these heights developed a particular swagger, a sense of elite status. They had ascended higher than any human had ever stood. When they descended for rest periods, they were treated like heroes returning from distant expeditions. They told tales of seeing the entire plain spread below them like a map, watching the sun rise from a vantage point closer to the heavens than the earth. They spoke of feeling in those moments at the top of the tower that they had transcended ordinary human limitations. Yet beneath this pride, fault lines were developing in the social structure of Shinar. The immense population had organized itself into distinct groups based on origin, skill, and role in the construction. The brickmakers considered themselves superior to the bitumen workers. Those who worked at the heights looked down, both literally and figuratively, on those who labored at ground level. People from different regions formed enclaves, maintaining their original languages and customs, even while participating in the common project. These divisions had been present from the beginning, but had been papered over by shared purpose and Nimrod's charismatic leadership. As the tower reached unprecedented heights, however, the strain of the project began to expose these fault lines. Disputes erupted over resource allocation. Why did the brickmakers receive larger food rations than the transporters, when transportation was equally exhausting? Why did certain ethnic groups seem to hold more supervisory positions? Why were the most dangerous jobs consistently assigned to the newest arrivals rather than distributed equally? Nimrod had grown distant from the day-to-day life of the common workers. Surrounded by his council and administrative apparatus, he spent his time in the palace complex that had been built near the tower's base. This palace itself was a marvel of architecture, though dwarfed by the tower it served. Here, Nimrod held court, received reports, made decisions, and planned the next phases of construction. The empire he had built to support the tower's construction had become vast, complex, and increasingly difficult to manage. His advisors brought him reports of the growing tensions, but Nimrod dismissed them as the inevitable complaints of those who lacked vision. Any great project faced resistance, he argued. Any transformative endeavor generated friction. The solution was not to slow down or address concerns, but to push forward with even greater intensity. Accelerate the work, demonstrate progress, show everyone that their sacrifices were achieving something unprecedented, and the complaints would fade. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong. The tower had reached 500 cubits, approximately 750 feet, an altitude that placed its summit high above anything else humans had ever constructed. At this height, the structure required constant maintenance. The weight of the upper levels placed tremendous stress on the lower foundations. Cracks appeared and had to be filled. Entire sections had to be reinforced. The engineering challenges multiplied exponentially with each additional cubit of height. A debate emerged among the architects and engineers. Some argued they had reached the practical limit of what could be built with current technology. The structure's base would need to be dramatically widened, they claimed, to support additional height. This would require partially demolishing and rebuilding lower levels, a prospect that could take years and would mean admitting that the original design was flawed. Others insisted they could continue upward with the current design. They proposed modifications, reinforcement techniques, novel approaches to weight distribution. These engineers, often younger and more ambitious, accused their conservative colleagues of lacking faith in the project. The debates grew heated, technical discussions transforming into personal attacks and political maneuvering. Nimrod, faced with this technical controversy, made a political decision rather than an engineering one. He sided with the faction that promised continued upward progress, not because their technical arguments were necessarily superior, but because stopping to widen the base would undermine the project's momentum. It would look like failure, like retreat, like an admission that perhaps the tower could not actually reach the heavens after all. Construction continued upward on the existing base. The workers, whatever their private doubts or personal grievances, continued to show up each day. The rhythm of the work had become life itself for most of them. The alternative, returning to their former lives in distant lands, seemed impossible to imagine. They had invested too much, sacrificed too much, believed too much. To abandon the project now would mean admitting that all of it had been for nothing. But the divine perspective on these events differed radically from the human one. In the heavenly realm, the Tower of Babel represented something the Creator had never before witnessed in human history. Previous human sins had been matters of individual choice or localized rebellion. Cain's murder of Abel was personal violence. The corruption that preceded the flood was widespread moral decay. But this was different. This was organized, collective, deliberate defiance. This was humanity consciously uniting to reject divine authority and establish its own sovereignty. The danger was not that they would literally reach heaven, as if heaven were a physical location that could be accessed by a sufficiently tall structure. The danger was in what successful completion of such a project would mean for human psychology and human history. If humanity could unite in sustained cooperation toward a common goal, if they could organize themselves with this level of complexity and maintain that organization across generations, if they could transform the landscape and reshape their world through collective will, then there would be no limit to what they might attempt. The Creator saw the trajectory of human ambition stretching forward through millennia. If this project succeeded, it would establish a pattern. Humans would learn that by uniting under sufficiently powerful leadership, they could accomplish anything. They would come to believe that they needed no power beyond themselves, no guidance except their own reason, no limits except those imposed by current technology. Each generation would attempt something more audacious than the last, and the memory of divine authority would fade into myth, then disappear entirely. More troubling still was the totalitarian nature of Nimrod's regime. The tower had required the submission of individual will to collective purpose. It had necessitated the creation of hierarchies and power structures that elevated some humans over others, that gave some the authority to direct the lives of thousands. This concentration of power in human hands, this willingness of the many to submit to the few, this transformation of human society into a machine serving a single purpose, all of this ran counter to the intended pattern of human life. The decision was made in the councils of heaven. Humanity's unity, which had made the tower possible, would be broken, not through destruction, not through violence, not through flood or fire, or any of the catastrophic judgments that might have been expected. Instead, through a subtle but profound intervention in the very mechanism that made unity possible: language. The morning arrived like any other on the plain of Shinar. Workers woke in their quarters, ate their morning meals, gathered their tools, and began the familiar journey to the tower site. The sun rose over the plain, illuminating the massive structure that had become the center of their world. Everything seemed normal, routine, predictable. The first indication that something had changed came from a brickmaker, who called out to his assistant in the usual way, requesting a tool. The assistant turned to him with an expression of complete incomprehension. The brickmaker repeated his request more loudly, assuming the assistant hadn't heard. The assistant responded, but his words made no sense. They weren't the familiar language of their people. They were sounds, certainly, sounds that seemed intended as communication, but they conveyed no meaning. Within minutes, chaos began to spread across the construction site like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Workers who had labored side by side for months or years suddenly could not understand each other. A supervisor shouted instructions that his crew stared at blankly. A foreman tried to coordinate a delicate operation requiring precise timing, but his words reached the workers as meaningless noise. The confusion quickly turned to alarm, then to something approaching panic. People began to frantically seek out others they could understand. Workers who had always spoken the same language found each other and clustered together, creating small islands of comprehension in a sea of Babel. These clusters soon realized that they could understand only their own group. Everyone else, regardless of how long they had worked together or how well they had previously communicated, now spoke what sounded like gibberish. Some tried to adapt quickly, using gestures and demonstrations to convey meaning. But construction of something as complex as the tower required more than simple hand signals. Technical instructions, precise measurements, coordination of multiple teams, all of this depended on clear verbal communication. A misunderstanding about which brick went where could compromise the structural integrity of an entire section. A confusion about the mixing ratios for mortar could create weak points that would threaten the whole edifice. Work ground to a halt. How could it continue when the brickmakers couldn't tell the transporters what needed to be moved? When the supervisors couldn't explain to the workers what needed to be done? When the engineers couldn't convey their designs to the construction crews? The entire elaborate system of coordination and cooperation that had made the tower possible collapsed in a matter of hours. The confusion at the construction site was mirrored throughout the city. In the markets, merchants could no longer negotiate with customers. In the administrative centers, officials found themselves unable to understand reports or issue orders. In homes, in some tragic cases, family members discovered they could no longer speak with each other if they had originally come from different regions and had spoken different, native languages before coming to Shinar. Nimrod received word of the catastrophe and rushed to the tower site. What he found there horrified him more than any military defeat could have. His great project, his monument to human achievement, his challenge to the divine order, stood silent and abandoned. Small groups of workers clustered together, speaking among themselves in their suddenly restored native languages, but unable to communicate with other groups. The complex machinery of cooperation he had built over years had been destroyed in moments. He tried to address the crowd, to rally them, to restore order. His words reached most of them as meaningless sounds. Only those who shared his original language could understand him, and they were a minority among the thousands gathered. He tried gesturing, demonstrating, pleading. Some groups nodded as if they understood, but when they tried to respond, their words were incomprehensible to him. The ruler who had commanded thousands, whose vision had moved nations, had been reduced to frustrated pantomime. The theological implications of what had happened slowly dawned on those who had the clarity of mind to think beyond immediate confusion. This was not a natural disaster. This was not disease or drought or any of the familiar misfortunes that plagued human communities. This was direct intervention, a supernatural event that could have only one source. The divine power they had sought to challenge had demonstrated its sovereignty in the most surgical possible way, dismantling their project without destroying it, breaking their unity without killing them. Within days, the plain of Shinar began to empty. Language groups recognized that they could no longer function in this confused, divided environment. They gathered their families, their possessions, and began to depart. Some headed north, others south, east, west, following ancient migratory routes back to ancestral lands or seeking new territories where they could build communities among people they could understand. The tower stood abandoned, a monument not to human achievement but to human hubris. Its massive bulk dominated the plain, visible for miles in every direction, but its silence was deafening. The kilns grew cold, the bitumen pits were left unattended, the elaborate ramps and scaffolding that had enabled its construction stood empty. Nimrod remained in his palace, surrounded by the shrinking population of those who still spoke his language. His empire, built on the foundation of the Tower Project, began to fragment. Provincial governors stopped responding to orders they could no longer understand. Trade networks collapsed when merchants couldn't negotiate with foreign partners. The administrative apparatus that had seemed so permanent and powerful proved to be entirely dependent on the ability of its parts to communicate. The dispersal of humanity from Shinar was not a simple geographic relocation. It represented a fundamental reorganization of human society. Where there had been one language and one culture developing in Shinar, there were now dozens, perhaps hundreds, of distinct language groups, each beginning to develop its own unique culture, customs, and identity. The unified human civilization that Nimrod had tried to create had been replaced by diversity, by distinction, by separation. Some of the departing groups carried with them the techniques they had learned in Shinar. The brickmaking technologies spread to new regions. The organizational methods were adapted to new purposes, but none attempted to resume the Tower Project. None tried to build another structure reaching to the heavens. The judgment at Babel had accomplished its purpose. Humanity had learned a lesson about the limits of collective ambition and the reality of divine sovereignty. Yet for those who had lived through it, who had devoted years of their lives to the tower's construction, the loss was devastating. Friendships that had formed across language barriers were suddenly impossible to maintain. Workers who had developed deep bonds with colleagues from different regions found themselves unable to say goodbye. The community they had built together dissolved before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to prevent it. The psychological impact was profound. Many who left Shinar carried with them a deep sense of failure and loss. They had believed they were part of something greater than themselves, something that would echo through eternity. They had sacrificed comfort, safety, sometimes family ties, to contribute to this grand vision. And in a single morning, it had all become impossible. The meaning they had found in the work vanished, leaving them to rebuild their sense of purpose in scattered lands. The tower itself began to deteriorate. Without constant maintenance, the forces of nature went to work on the structure. Rain seeped into cracks, freezing and expanding in winter, causing bricks to break and crumble. Wind eroded exposed surfaces. Plants took root in gaps between bricks, their roots slowly prying the structure apart. What humans had spent years building, nature began to reclaim. Yet even in ruins, even abandoned and crumbling, the tower maintained its power over the human imagination. Travelers passing through the plain would stop to stare at it, to wonder at its size, to speculate about the ambitions that had driven its construction. Stories about the tower spread to distant lands, carried by those who had worked on it or seen it. These stories were told and retold, taking on legendary qualities, until the historical reality became impossible to separate from mythic embellishment. The ancient text tells us that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that humanity was building. This simple phrase conceals profound theological implications. The God who sees all things, who knows the thoughts of every heart before they are formed, who understands the end from the beginning, nevertheless descends. The language suggests not ignorance requiring investigation, but rather a divine legal proceeding. A formal witness bearing testimony before judgment is rendered. In the courtroom of cosmic history, God arrives to examine the evidence with his own eyes. What he sees troubles him deeply, not because humanity has achieved too much, not because their engineering prowess threatens divine supremacy, but because he recognizes in this moment the full trajectory of human ambition unmoored from divine purpose. The tower stands as Exhibit 1 in the case against unchecked human pride. God speaks, and his words carry the weight of both sadness and necessity. Behold, he says, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. This divine observation has perplexed interpreters across millennia. Is God threatened by human achievement? Does he fear competition? The question misunderstands entirely the nature of the concern. God recognizes not threat, but tragedy in the making. He sees a humanity that has learned to unite its considerable powers, not for the flourishing of all creation, not for the blessing of the earth, not for the multiplication of justice and mercy, but for the aggrandizement of its own name. He sees the architecture of every future tyranny embedded in the bricks of Babel. He sees the blueprint for every totalitarian nightmare that will plague human history. The unity God observes is not the unity he intended for his image bearers. It is a forced uniformity, a manufactured consensus, a collectivism that erases particularity and diversity in favor of a single controlling vision. It is the unity of the ant colony, the beehive, the machine, not the unity of a family of diverse peoples living in mutual respect and blessing. God recognizes that if this project succeeds, if humanity learns that its greatest achievements come through the suppression of diversity and the enforcement of absolute conformity, then the pattern is set for millennia of suffering. More ominously, God perceives that this is only the beginning. If humanity succeeds at Babel, if they prove that unity through uniformity can achieve impossible things, then what will they attempt next? What greater acts of hubris will follow? What more dangerous expressions of pride will emerge from a species that has learned it can storm heaven itself through sheer collective willpower? The tower is not the end, but the beginning of an escalating pattern of rebellion. The judgment that follows is both severe and merciful, both punishment and protection. Come, God says, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. The divine plurality appears again, that same mysterious council that declared at creation, let us make man in our image. Now the heavenly court reconvenes, not to create but to scatter, not to unite but to diversify, not to build up but to tear down. The confusion of languages happens swiftly. One moment, the workers share a common tongue, coordinate their efforts with perfect understanding, communicate their vision with crystalline clarity. The next moment, Babel. The word itself, which the builders intended to mean gate of God, becomes forever associated with confused, meaningless noise. The foreman shouts orders that make no sense to the laborers. The engineers call for materials and receive blank stares. The architects explain their designs to uncomprehending craftsmen. The whole magnificent system of coordination collapses in an instant. Imagine the chaos of that moment. The confusion spreading through the workforce like wildfire. The growing panic as people realize they can no longer understand their neighbors, their colleagues, their own family members. The desperate attempts to communicate through gestures and drawings. The frustration mounting as even these prove inadequate for complex ideas. The gradual realization that something fundamental has changed, that the old world of perfect mutual understanding has ended forever. The text tells us that the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. The scattering is both consequence and mercy. Consequence because the judgment of Babel is precisely calibrated to undo what made the project possible in the first place. If unified language enabled unified action, then confused languages will force dispersion. If staying together in one place concentrated human power dangerously, then scattering across the earth will distribute it more safely. But mercy operates here too, perhaps even more profoundly than judgment. God scatters humanity to protect them from themselves. He breaks their unity to prevent them from achieving the kind of collective power that would enable even greater acts of rebellion. He confuses their languages to keep them from the terrible fate that awaits any species that successfully storms heaven through its own efforts. The scattering is an act of grace disguised as judgment, a surgery that feels like punishment but actually saves the patient from a far worse death. The abandoned tower stands for generations afterward as a monument to what happens when human ambition exceeds its proper bounds. Travelers passing through the region tell stories of the massive structure, already beginning to decay, bricks loosening in the desert wind, the top levels never completed, the whole enterprise arrested in mid-construction. Some say it remains there still, buried beneath the sands of time, waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists who will try to piece together what happened in that place so long ago. The memory of Babel sears itself into human consciousness. It becomes the defining trauma of early humanity, the moment when everything changed, when the unity of the human race shattered into 1,000 competing languages and cultures. Grandparents tell the story to their grandchildren, emphasizing different lessons depending on their perspective. Some focus on divine judgment against pride. Others emphasize the blessing of diversity. Still others see tragedy, the loss of an earlier golden age when all people understood one another perfectly. As the scattered peoples migrate to distant lands, they carry with them fragments of the Babel story, and these fragments evolve into the various flood and tower legends found in cultures around the world. The Sumerian tale of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata describes a time when all people spoke one language before a great dispersion. Ancient Mesoamerican cultures preserve stories of a great tower built after a flood. Greek mythology remembers the giants who attempted to storm Olympus by piling mountains upon mountains. Each culture retains its own refracted memory of what happened at Babel. But the biblical account remains the most theologically profound because it alone captures the full significance of what occurred. Babel is not merely a story about linguistic diversity or cultural pluralism. It is a story about the human condition itself, about the persistent temptation to usurp God's place, about the danger of unity without diversity, about the thin line between legitimate achievement and illegitimate pride. The consequences of Babel ripple through all of subsequent human history. The confusion of languages creates the conditions for the rise of distinct peoples, nations, and civilizations. The common Semitic stock, from which Abraham will later emerge, disperses into multiple language groups. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 maps out how Noah's descendants spread across the known world, forming the various peoples who will interact, compete, trade, and war throughout ancient history. From the perspective of the biblical narrative, Babel represents the end of human unity apart from God and sets the stage for a different kind of unity to emerge, one built not on human presumption but on divine promise. If humanity cannot save itself through collective achievement, then salvation must come through another means. If the tower to heaven failed, then perhaps heaven must reach down to earth in a different way. The story of Scripture after Babel becomes the story of God working through particularity rather than universality. Instead of addressing all humanity at once, God chooses one man, Abraham, and through him one family, one people, one nation. The goal remains the blessing of all peoples, but now the method changes. Instead of humanity uniting to make a name for itself, God will make a great name for one people, so that through them, all the families of the earth will be blessed. This represents a complete reversal of the Babel strategy. Where Babel sought glory through concentration, God's plan works through dispersion. Where Babel pursued greatness through uniformity, God's plan celebrates diversity. Where Babel tried to ascend to heaven, God's plan descends to earth. The contrast could not be starker. Theologians throughout history have recognized Babel as the anti-Pentecost, the moment when unified human speech became confused Babel, to be reversed only when the Holy Spirit descends at Pentecost and enables people of every language to understand the apostles speaking in their own tongues. What was broken at Babel begins to be healed at Pentecost, though the healing follows a different pattern than the original unity. At Pentecost, diversity is celebrated rather than erased. People hear in their own languages rather than being forced to adopt one universal language. This suggests that God's intent is not to restore the monolingual uniformity that existed before Babel, but to create a new kind of unity that transcends linguistic and cultural barriers while preserving them. The gospel goes to all nations, but it does not erase nationality. It translates into all languages, but does not replace them with one sacred tongue. The church becomes a community of radical diversity united by common faith rather than common speech. The legacy of Babel extends far beyond biblical theology into the realms of politics, philosophy, and culture. The tower has become a universal symbol of overreaching ambition, of projects doomed by their own hubris. When people speak of someone's Babel, they mean an overly ambitious scheme likely to collapse under its own weight. The very word Babel in multiple languages carries connotations of confusion, noise, meaningless chatter. Yet Babel also represents something deeply human, the ineradicable impulse to build, to achieve, to transcend limits. Every skyscraper echoes Babel. Every United Nations building, every international organization, every attempt to bring all peoples together under one system carries something of Babel's DNA. The question becomes not whether we will attempt collective achievements, but what motivates them and what limits we acknowledge. Some modern readers see the Babel story as anti-progress, a divine intervention to keep humanity backward and divided. This reading misses the point entirely. God does not oppose human achievement as such. The cultural mandate to fill and subdue the earth requires technological progress. God opposes achievement pursued for the wrong reasons. Unity built on the wrong foundation, progress that forgets its proper limits. The difference between legitimate and illegitimate human achievement turns on the question of purpose. Are we building to bless or to boast? Are we uniting to serve or to dominate? Are we reaching upward in humble dependence on God or in proud independence from Him? These questions determine whether our towers reach toward heaven or toward hell. History provides ample examples of Babel-like projects pursued with disastrous results. The totalitarian nightmares of the 20th century all shared Babel's key features: forced uniformity, suppression of diversity, megalomaniacal building projects, leaders who demanded worship, citizens mobilized toward impossible goals. The parallels are too obvious to miss. From Stalin's vast construction projects, worked by slave labor, to Hitler's thousand-year Reich, to Mao's Great Leap Forward, the pattern of Babel repeats whenever leaders attempt to unite humanity through coercion and build monuments to their own glory. Each such project eventually collapses under its own weight, brought down not primarily by external enemies, but by internal contradictions. The confusion of languages at Babel becomes the economic collapse in the Soviet Union, the military defeat of Nazi Germany, the famine in China. The divine judgment that fell on the original tower continues to fall on every structure built on the same faulty foundation. Yet the temptation of Babel remains powerful because it promises what humanity most desperately wants: security, significance, transcendence. We want to be safe from future disasters, so we build ever higher towers. We want our lives to matter, so we pursue collective projects that will outlast us. We want to transcend our mortality and limitations, so we reach toward the heavens through technology, ideology, or religion. None of these desires is wrong in itself. God created us to build, to achieve, to transcend our animal nature. The problem comes when we pursue these goods in the wrong way, when we seek security apart from trust in God, significance apart from serving God's purposes, transcendence apart from submission to God's will. Babel teaches us that the path upward paradoxically begins with descent, with humility, with acknowledgement of our dependence on the one who is truly high and lifted up. The physical Tower of Babel crumbles into dust, but the spiritual Tower of Babel rebuilds itself in every generation. Each time humanity trusts in its own wisdom rather than God's, each time we unite around false gods rather than the true God, each time we build monuments to ourselves rather than temples to our Creator, we lay another brick in Babel. And each time, God in His mercy intervenes to confuse our plans and scatter our presumption before we destroy ourselves. This pattern of divine intervention reveals something crucial about how God governs history. He does not prevent all human evil. He allows us enormous freedom to pursue our projects and plans. But when those projects reach a critical mass of danger, when they threaten to establish patterns that would corrupt all future generations, God acts decisively to stop them. The flood destroyed a civilization that had become irredeemably corrupt. Babel scattered a humanity that was learning to unite for the wrong reasons. Later judgments will fall on Sodom, on Egypt, on Canaan, on Babylon itself, wherever human evil concentrates dangerously. Yet judgment is never the last word. After the flood came the covenant with Noah. After Babel came the calling of Abraham. After every divine judgment in Scripture comes a new chapter in the story of redemption. God tears down what humanity has wrongly built, so that he can build something better in its place. The confusion of Babel creates the context for the eventual gathering of all nations around the throne of the Lamb. In the book of Revelation, the story arc of Scripture moves from the unity of Eden through the dispersion of Babel to the gathering of Revelation. The pattern is not simple restoration, but transformation. We do not simply return to Eden's garden, but arrive at the New Jerusalem city. We do not recover one language, but discover a deeper unity beneath all languages. We do not erase the diversity created at Babel, but redeem it, transforming what began as judgment into blessing. This redemptive movement shows us that God wastes nothing, not even the consequences of human sin. The scattering at Babel produces the richness of human cultures and languages that will one day bring their glory and honor into the New Jerusalem. The confusion that seemed like pure loss becomes, in God's hands, the raw material for a more beautiful unity than existed before. Every language develops its own unique ways of expressing truth and beauty. Every culture discovers aspects of human flourishing that others miss. The diversity, forced by Babel's judgment, becomes, in the fullness of time, the diversity celebrated in the kingdom of God. But we should not romanticize this process. The diversity of Babel comes through trauma, through the painful sundering of what was once whole. Families are separated, communities fragment. The easy communication of earlier days gives way to the hard work of translation and the ever-present possibility of misunderstanding. Wars between peoples, ethnic hatred, racism, nationalism, all these evils trace their roots back to the scattering at Babel. The legacy of Babel is thus profoundly ambiguous. It preserves humanity from one set of dangers while exposing us to others. It prevents the totalitarian nightmare of perfect unity under human control while creating the conditions for tribalism, xenophobia, and perpetual conflict between peoples. The cure for Babel's disease carries its own painful side effects. This ambiguity reflects the nature of God's judgments generally. They are always calibrated to be both just and merciful, both punished and protection. They address the immediate crisis while setting up conditions for future redemption. They tear down what must not stand while preserving space for what can be built. Divine judgment, properly understood, is not the opposite of divine love, but its tough expression. The love that cares too much to let us destroy ourselves. The tower itself, that massive ziggurat, becomes in subsequent biblical literature a symbol of everything opposed to God's kingdom. When the prophets denounce Babylon, they invoke the memory of Babel. The great city that enslaved God's people and destroyed his temple is the inheritor of the original Babel's rebellion. The cosmic Babylon of Revelation, drunk on the blood of the saints, represents the ultimate expression of Babel's impulse toward domination and self-glorification. Yet even Babylon will fall. The pattern established at Babel repeats throughout history. Every empire that exalts itself above God eventually collapses. Every tower built on pride eventually topples. Every attempt to create heaven on earth through human effort alone ends in confusion and dispersion. The lesson of Babel is the lesson of all history. God will not be mocked, and pride goes before destruction. But the inverse is also true. Every act of genuine humility opens space for divine blessing. Every acknowledgement of dependence creates opportunity for divine provision. Every confession of limitation becomes the starting point for receiving divine strength. If Babel shows us what happens when humanity reaches too high, the rest of Scripture shows us what happens when we bow low enough for God to lift us up. The story of Babel ends with dispersion, but it is not the end of the story. The The scattered peoples carry with them the image of God, the capacity for relationship with their Creator, the possibility of redemption. They multiply and fill the earth as God originally commanded. They develop languages and cultures of stunning beauty and complexity. They demonstrate the incredible diversity of ways that humans can organize societies, express meaning, and pursue flourishing. And in the fullness of time, God begins the long work of gathering what Babel scattered. He calls Abraham and promises that through his descendants all the families of the earth will be blessed. He delivers Israel from Egypt and gives them a law that will be a light to the nations. He sends prophets who envision a day when all peoples will stream to Jerusalem to learn God's ways. He sends his own Son, whose death and resurrection open the way for people from every tribe and language and nation to be reconciled to God. The New Testament sees Jesus as the ultimate answer to Babel. Where the tower builders sought to ascend to God through their own efforts, God descends to humanity in the Incarnation. Where Babel represented human pride, Jesus embodies divine humility. Where Babel sought to make a name for humanity, God makes the name of Jesus the name above all names. Where Babel ended in confusion and scattering, Jesus brings clarity and gathering. On the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit reverses Babel's curse, at least partially and proleptically. The disciples speak in tongues, and people from every nation under heaven hear them in their own languages. The confusion of Babel gives way to the clarity of Pentecost. But notice that the solution is not to eliminate linguistic diversity and return to one, language. Instead, the gospel translates into every language, dignifying each tongue as a fit vehicle for truth. This pattern continues throughout church history. The message of Christ spreads into every language group, every culture, every tribe and nation. The Bible gets translated into thousands of languages. Churches spring up that worship in innumerable styles. The unity of the faith expresses itself through breathtaking diversity of practice. What Babel broke apart, Christ is gathering together, but in a new way that honors rather than erases difference. The Tower of Babel stands in our memory as a permanent warning against the dangers of human ambition untempered by divine wisdom. It reminds us that our grandest projects can be our greatest folly. It teaches us that unity achieved through domination is not true unity. It shows us that reaching for heaven in pride leads to deeper descent than simply staying on earth in humility. But Babel also reveals the mercy of God in judgment, the wisdom of God in working through the consequences of human sin to achieve redemptive purposes. The scattering that looked like pure tragedy becomes the seedbed of cultural richness. The confusion that seemed to end all hope of mutual understanding creates the condition for a better, deeper unity built on shared faith rather than shared language. As we stand in our own age, looking at our own towers of technological prowess, ideological certainty, and collective achievement, the story of Babel confronts us with uncomfortable questions. What are we building and why? In whose name do we pursue our greatest ambitions? What kind of unity are we creating, and at what cost? Are we ascending toward God or away from Him? These questions matter, because the pattern of Babel continues to repeat itself. Every generation faces the temptation to trust in its own wisdom, to unite around false gods, to build monuments to human pride. Every age thinks it has finally transcended the mistakes of the past, that this time we will get it right, that our tower will succeed where all previous ones failed. And every age eventually learns the same lesson that the builders of Babel learned. God will not share His glory with another, and every tower built on sand will fall. Yet even as we acknowledge these sobering truths, we need not despair. The same God who confused languages at Babel also promised to bless all nations through Abraham. The same God who scattered humanity across the earth also sent His Son to gather them back. The same God who judged human pride also offers grace to the humble. The story of Babel is not the end but the beginning of a longer story that culminates in the gathering of all nations around the throne of God. In that ultimate gathering, the curse of Babel will be fully reversed. Revelation describes a multitude that no one can number, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing before the throne and crying out with one voice. Unity and diversity will finally be perfectly harmonized. The many languages will not collapse into one, but all will speak the same praise. The different cultures will not disappear into uniformity, but all will bring their unique gifts to honor the same king. This vision reframes everything about Babel. What looked like judgment becomes the necessary prelude to a greater blessing. What seemed like defeat becomes the setup for a more glorious victory. What appeared to end human hopes becomes the beginning of divine salvation. The tower that reached toward heaven in pride will be replaced by a city descending from heaven in grace. The name humanity tried to make for itself will be forgotten in the light of the name above all names. As the ancient tower crumbles into dust and memory, as the scattered peoples pursue their separate destinies across the earth, as languages multiply and cultures diversify, the plan of God continues to unfold. Babel is not the final word. It is one chapter in a story whose author sees the end from the beginning, who works all things according to the counsel of his will, who can bring beauty from ashes and order from chaos and unity from confusion. The greatest ambition of humanity failed at Babel, but the greatest ambition of God succeeds in Christ, and in that success, even Babel's failure finds its redemption.